What would Jesus say to Boris Johnson? Well, now there's a question, and my initial response when somebody asked me that was to say we don't really do kind of politics at Solas. We really like to stay focused on Jesus and the gospel, but it's a hugely important question actually because everyone is talking about politics right now. And the first thing I think I'd want to say in reflecting on that question is, of course, here in the UK, Christians are not as divided along political lines as perhaps they are in some other countries. You know, if you look at our two major parties here, both Conservative and Labour, both of those have deeply, deeply Christian roots. And thus you can find men and women who are followers of Christ across the political spectrum. But we do have a new Prime Minister in the shape of the blonde bombshell, Boris Johnson, and he's hugely controversial. My Facebook feed seems to be full of people who either love him or hate him. So what would Jesus have to say to Boris, and how can Christians engage this topic? Well, the first thing I think I would say that Jesus might say, I think, to Boris Johnson would be to shine a spotlight on the tribalism. You know, it's very easy for political leaders to appeal to tribes. So, you know, you appeal to those people who support you, you turn them against the people who hate you, and particularly when you weaponize that on social media, politics gets really, really nasty. But Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, said specifically, "Blessed are the peacemakers." So I think one of the first things Jesus might say to our new Prime Minister is, how, Boris, could you be somebody who reaches out across party lines, who embraces and welcomes those who may disagree with everything you stand for, but you don't respond to insult with insult? Could you be a political leader who actually tries to build harmony and build reconciliation and build listening, because that's what the gospel looks like when incarnated into politics. That's the first thing. Second thing that Jesus might say to Boris Johnson is to remind Boris, in no uncertain terms, that God is no respecter of persons. You know, we live in a culture that encourages all of us, but particularly those in the public eye, to think of themselves, to think of each other in terms of how much they're worth, how influential they are, how much power they have, how great their social media followings are, and so on. But Jesus consistently, in his dealings with people, wasn't interested in those kind of very outward trappings of influence. He was far more interested in what someone's heart and someone's character is like, and he was particularly interested in how people dealt with those who were poor and weak and on the margins of society. You know, it consistently challenges me to reflect on the fact that when God stepped into history in the person of Jesus, he didn't come as a king or an emperor or even, you know, the high priest or any of these kind of positions of power in his culture. Rather, he came as a small child born into weakness and poverty there in a bed of straw in the manger. And that's a reminder to all of us that God is far more concerned, I think, with our character and who we are on the inside rather than those outward trappings. And I think Jesus might remind Boris of that. And then thirdly, I think Jesus might sit down with Boris and talk to him about the state of his own heart. Because you see, Boris's failures, of which there have been many, both professionally and personally, all over the pages of the newspapers. And depending which newspapers you read, either people love to highlight all of Boris's spectacular personal failures, his string of relationships and other things he's done, and weaponize those to beat him over the head with, or you find newspapers and people online who support him defending those and explaining them away. I don't think Jesus has time for any of those positions, because Jesus consistently said that no matter who you are, whether you are a king in a palace, a politician in Downing Street, or just an ordinary person in the street, what you need to do is get right with God and receive God's forgiveness and reconciliation and healing for the sin and the brokenness in each of our lives. And I think Jesus might say to Boris, how do we talk about not so much the UK and the European Union as perhaps you, Boris, and your relationship or lack thereof with the God who loved you and created you and wants you to be put back into relationship with him. What would Jesus say to Boris Johnson? Be a peacemaker, one who brings unity, not division. Be somebody who is not distracted by the trappings of power and all those outward signs, but focuses on your character and what you're like on the inside and treats others with dignity and respect, especially the lowest. And then Jesus would also say, make sure that you receive God's reconciliation and forgiveness and get put right with him. That's what Jesus might say to Boris Johnson. It's also, interestingly, what Jesus says to each and every one of us.